Okay, we are ending this course with presentations on feudalism and its transformation to pre-capitalist economic organizations. Now, during what is described as Europe's Middle Ages, between approximately 800 to 1500 of the Common Era, law and custom assigned everyone a specific place in the socioeconomic order. You either fought, you prayed, or you worked. Of course, the majority of society worked. Now, the feudal system was based on mutual obligations. In exchange for military protection and other services, a lord or landowner was granted land called a fief, and the person receiving a fief was called a vassal. Feudalism depended on the control of the land, and that is key, because a vassal swore an oath to be faithful and to serve his lord amongst all others. However, a lord did not have complete power over his vassal. And as we learned previously, Charlemagne ruled that if a lord tried to kill a vassal, or take his land, or steal his wife or daughter, or failed to defend him, or make him a serf, then the vassal was no longer obliged to serve the lord. Now, in feudal Europe, nobody truly owned the land. The king was a vassal to God. So we're talking about some serious business here, because the king's fief, it was believed, was a gift from God for being a wise ruler. Nobles were vassals to the king, who gave them land in exchange for services. Nobles then granted smaller fiefs to lesser nobles, and their rights stemmed from royal documents known as patents of nobility, which granted them and their ancestors the status of noble and privileges that went with that status. Tenants or free peasants held very small pieces of land from minor lords in exchange for services or rent. So the structure of feudal society is well expressed in the phrase, "No man without a master, no land without a lord." The feudal pyramid often became a complex tangle of conflicting loyalties. Both lords and vassals tried to use these relationships to their own advantage. And at the peak reigned the king. And next came the most powerful vassals, wealthy landowners such as nobles and bishops. And the superior person to whom service was owed was the vassal's suzerain. Serving beneath these vassals were knights. Knights were mounted warriors who pledged to defend their lord's lands in exchange for fiefs. And at the base of the pyramid were landless peasants who toiled in the fields. So the feudal pyramid is very important because social class was inherited. And since the medieval era, it was understood that there were those who fought, the nobles and knights. There were those who prayed, men and women of the church, and those who worked the land, the peasants. And in Europe, throughout the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people were peasants. And most of the peasants were identified as serfs. Now, serfs were people who could not lawfully leave the place where they were born. Though bound to the land, serfs were not identified as slaves. Their lords could not buy or sell them. Yet the wealth of the feudal lords came from the labor of the peasants. Now, the manor system was the basic economic arrangement in feudal society. The manor was the lord's estate. The manor system rested on a set of rights and obligations between a lord and his serfs. The lord provided the serfs with housing, strips of farmland, and protection from outside invaders and bandits. And in return, the serfs tended the lord's lands, known as the domain. They cared for his animals, and they performed other tasks to maintain the estate. And peasant women shared in the farm work with their husbands. All peasants, whether free or serf, owed the lord certain duties. And these included at least a few days' labor each week and a certain portion of their grain. So if you were a peasant, you rarely traveled more than 25 miles from your own manor. And by standing in the center of a plowed field, you could see your entire world at a glance. And that was it. And the manor usually covered only a few square miles of land. And it typically consisted of the Lord's manor house, a church, and some workshops. And generally speaking, about 15 to 30 families lived in the village on a manor. And fields and pastures and forests surrounded the village. And sometimes a stream wound through the manor. And streams and ponds provided fish, which served an important source of food. The manor was largely a self-sufficient community. The serfs and peasants raised and produced nearly everything, especially what they needed for daily life: crops, fuel, cloth, leather goods, and lumber. The only outside purchases were salt, iron, and a few unusual objects such as millstones. And millstones were huge stones that were used to grind flour. Now, for the privilege of living on the Lord's lands, peasants paid a high price. They paid a tax on all grain ground on the Lord's mill. And any attempt to dodge taxes by baking bread elsewhere was treated as a crime. Peasants also paid a tax on marriage. Weddings could take place only with the Lord's consent. And after all these payments to the Lord, peasant families owed the village priest a tithe or a church tax. And a tithe usually represented 1/10 of their income. So peasants owned very little outright. Usually a family had a few animals, some pigs, a hen, maybe a cow, and some owned tools, such as a hoe or an axe, a spade, or a barrel. The wealthier peasants owned more household items. Peasants usually shared their cottages with their farm animals. And it was especially for the farm animals' safety. And a small fire used for cooking and warmth was kept burning in the center of the cottage. There was no chimney, and smoke left the cottage through a hole in the roof. Now, it was through warfare the feudal lords defended their estates. They seized new territories, and they increased their wealth. So lords and their armies lived in a very violent society. And this violence, or this society prized, was based on combat skills. So to defend their territories, feudal lords raised private armies. And in exchange for military service, feudal lords used their most abundant resource, which was land. They rewarded knights, their most skilled warriors, with fiefs from their sprawling estates. Wealth from these fiefs allowed knights to devote their lives to war. War. Knights could afford to pay for costly weapons, armor, and war horses. And this dedication to war required skilled technicians in the manufacture of weapons and armor, and most importantly, in the training of horses. You cannot just take a horse to war. That horse must be trained. Warfare was serious business, and it was very costly to the knight. As the Lord's vassal, a knight's main obligation was to serve in battle. And from each of his knights, a lord typically demanded about 40 days of mounted combat each year. Knights' pastimes revolved around the training for war. Wrestling and hunting helped knights gain strength and practice, because those were the skills that they would need on the battlefield. Understanding the game of chess was crucial in developing strategies for mounted success. Now, the code of chivalry. This was a very complex set of ideals that demanded that a knight fought bravely in defense of three masters. The knight devoted himself to his earthly feudal lord, his heavenly lord, and his chosen lady. The knight was to protect the weak and the poor. And the ideal knight was loyal, brave, and courteous. But you see, most knights never really reached this ideal because they treated the lower classes brutally, and they didn't like them. They treated them with disdain. But nonetheless, both the feudal elite and the church are going to view women as inferior to men. And in contrast, the idea of this romantic love that we've all grown up with, placing this noble woman on a pedestal where they could be worshipped. See, a true knight pledged to protect all women. And he also might love and serve and adore a particular lady, but preferably from afar. So I am sending a warning to all you ladies who are out there. If you are waiting for your knight in shining armor, just remember you're going to have to pick up after his horse. Now, women's roles were limited to the home and convent, and most women were poor and powerless, and their roles were confined to performing endless labor, bearing children, and taking care of their families. And under feudalism, only noble women could inherit an estate from her husband. And sometimes, upon her lord's request, she could also send his knights to war. Now, if her husband was off fighting, she might act as a military commander and a warrior. Noble women often played key roles in defending castles. Some dressed in armor, some mounted war horses, and some mobilized cavalries of knights. But they were ineligible to receive land as reward in exchange for military service. And women also held less property, because usually lords passed their fiefs to their sons, not their daughters. Now it brings us to the church. Now, the church shaped the lives of people from all social classes. As the church expanded its political role, strong rulers began to question the Pope's authority. Dramatic power struggles unfolded in the Holy Roman Empire, the scene of mounting tensions between popes and emperors. The church established its own hierarchical organization. The distribution of power was based on status. Church structure consisted of different ranks of clergy or religious officials. The Pope headed the church in Rome, and all clergy, including bishops and priests, fell under his authority. And basically, the clergy was divided into two groups, the secular and the regular. The secular clergy included the Pope, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and priests who interacted with the secular world. Bishops supervised priests, the lowest ranking members of the secular clergy. Bishops settled disputes over church teachings and religious practices. And for most people, local priests served as the main contact with the church. The regular clergy included abbots or monastery heads, monks and nuns who worked and lived in monasteries and were generally separated from the world. Feudalism and the manor system created divisions among people, but the shared beliefs and the teachings of the church bonded people together. During an era of constant warfare and political turmoil, the church was a stable force because the church provided Catholics a sense of security and a religious community to which they might belong. They could follow the same path to salvation, which was everlasting life in heaven. Priests and other religious officials administered the sacraments. These were important religious ceremonies, and these rites paved the way for achieving salvation. Now, at the local level, the village church was the unifying force in the daily lives of most people. It served as a religious and social center, and people worshiped together at the church. They also met and talked with other villagers. Religious holidays, especially Christmas and Easter, were occasions for social gatherings and festive celebrations. Now, the work of the monasteries, even though separated and sheltered from the world, was very important to the culture of Europe. And we have seen how the monastic tradition of Christianity developed in the deserts of Egypt and Syria during the Roman Empire. Now, at a monastery at Monte Cassino, a former Roman official and monk named Benedict took the desert monastic tradition and transformed it into something quite new, creating the Benedictine rule. And in essence, it was a constitution for monks and their monasteries to follow, containing obligations to perform manual labor, to meditate, and to pray. It included vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the monastery head. And as monasteries spread, they transmitted learning by creating schools for young people, including schools for peasants to learn trades. And they provided food and shelter for the poor, and hospitals, medical treatment for the sick. Monasteries also preserved classical religious and environmental religious writings, or what Jewish, Christian, and Muslim followers referred to as pagan. Monks, starting with Pope Gregory I in 597, copied ancient texts, preserved and transmitted them, and spread the message of Christianity throughout Europe. And by the mid-11th century, most Europeans were Catholic. Now, the church created a system of justice to guide people's conduct. All Catholics, kings and peasants alike, were subject to canon law, or the law of the church, especially in matters of marriage and religious practice. The church established courts to try people accused of violating canon law. And two of the harshest punishments that offenders faced were excommunication and the interdict. Popes used the threat of excommunication, which was banishment from the church, to wield power over political rulers. For example, a disobedient king's quarrel with the Pope might result in excommunication. And this meant that the king would be denied salvation. And excommunication also freed the king's vassals from their duties to him. If an excommunicated king continued to disobey the Pope in turn could use an even more frightening weapon, the interdict. And under the interdict, many sacraments and religious services could not be performed in the king's lands. As Catholics, the king's subjects believed that without such sacraments, they might be doomed to eternal suffering in hell. Now, little did people know that in the 21st century, the road to hell would be paved with Republicans, allowing Democrats clear passage. So this ends part one of Europe's Middle Ages. And we have come to appreciate several practices and institutions that shaped the lives of the people, because the feudal system was based on mutual obligations. And the feudal pyramid often became a tangle of complexing loyalties. Both lords and vassals tried to use these relationships to their advantage. The social class was usually inherited. And since the medieval era, it was understood that there were those who fought, the nobles and the knights, there were those who prayed, the men and women of the church, and those who worked the land, which were the majority, the peasants. So the manor system was the basic economic arrangement in feudal Europe. The manor was largely a self-sufficient community. And for the privilege of living on the Lord's land, the peasants paid a high price, because peasants owned very little outright. But it was through warfare. Feudal lords defended their estates, seized new territories, and increased their wealth. And lords and their armies lived in a violent society that prized combat skills. We have inherited that violence. Both the feudal elite and the church viewed women as inferior to men, and likewise, we have inherited the practice of patriarchal misogyny. And finally, the church shaped the lives of all people from all social classes.